Welcome to On the Brink, a fresh lens to take you and your business to new heights. Hi, I'm Andi Simon. I'm your host and your guide. And as such, you remember that my job is to help you get off the brink. I want you to soar again. And sometimes you need some new ideas, a fresh approach, interesting ways to see, feel, and think in new ways. Remember, we decide with our eyes and our heart. And all of a sudden you say, I don't know where I'm going. I keep hearing over and over among my clients, even my colleagues, my friends, what's next? And so it's important for you to begin to see what is next, regardless of where you are on your life's journey. It's good to have a vision for yourself, a personal one, of what you would like to see happen as you go through life. It's better than figuring it out on the fly, and it's better than trying to make decisions without any direction. But it's always interesting to listen to wonderful people who have had great journeys, and they want to share them with you so that you too can see how life can move along and take you to great places. So today, Evelyn Medvin, a wonderful woman who's a chapter in my book, Rethink, Smashing the Myths of Women in Business. And Evelyn is just wonderful. Her story is wonderful. But she, celebrates being a geoscientist when there aren't many women there. And so she introduced me to Christina Sistrunk. Now, Christina has had a very wonderful career. Let me tell you about her. Then she'll tell you about her own journey. But listen carefully, because she has grown in the world that women aren't usually successful in. And when you begin to understand others and they become your role models, you begin to say, oh, that's how we do it. And oh, of course I can do it. And next thing you know, remember, if I can't see it, I can't be it. So see her as somebody who you too could be. So here's Christina's little bit of her resume. Over 30 years, Christina has held management and executive roles focusing on assessing and delivering next level performance. And that's always an interesting term. She's led organizations across upstream E&P, both IOC and independent, ranging in revenue from 2 to 10 billion. She was CEO of Era Energy for 5 years. I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about what E&P means and what CEO of Era Energy was like. But I'll finish her resume so that we can get into her story. She has experience with organizational turnarounds, including cash management and restructuring. Her focus has been on value creation through the development of effective strategy, execution, improved leadership capability, and accountability. Now, you know that I have several leadership academies out there. And one of the themes for leaders is followers. And how do you hold them accountable? And how do they get inspired to want to do this so that they're giving the gift of giving back, as opposed to waiting to be told what to do? So her expertise is extremely relevant, regardless of what industry you're in. She's improved cash flow and profitability while creating step changes in safety and environmental performance and stakeholder engagement. Prior to her CEO role, she was a VP with Shell, focused on, of all things, deep water production, and then the Arctic strategy, which is sort of interesting all by herself. Now, she started her career after earning a BS in chemical engineering from the Ohio State University, but she's ready to tell you more about who is Christina Sistrunk and why it's so wonderful to have her on the Brink today. Christina, thank you for joining me.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for making the time for us to talk.
You have a great smile. We're going to do a lot of smiling today. Tell the audience, both the viewer and the listener, all about Christina, your journey, what made you choose to go into this field. I have a hunch there weren't a lot of female role models who were embracing it, enticing it, but you're, I bet, an explorer and one who's willing to take on all kinds of new stuff, solving complex problems in different ways and giving a great twist to the journey that you've been on. Who are you? And tell our audience all about you.
Well, thank you so much. I think I'll start kind of at the beginning, right? So I was raised in a town of 7,000 people in a rural part of Ohio. And neither of my parents graduated from high school.
Oh my, what a great beginning.
Yeah. And so thinking about what I wanted to do career-wise, I went through public school and really had an interest in science and math. And actually, at a fairly young age, my recollection is it was sometime around when I was about 12. My dad, who worked in a union job in a factory, sat me down and said, look, every time you come home excited about what you might want to do and what you want to be when you grow up, it requires college. And he said, you have to understand, we don't have the resources to do that. And he said, we'll do everything we can to try and support you, but that's not something that you can necessarily count on. So you're going to have to figure out how to make this work if that's what you really want. So I got very focused on academics and what I needed to do and where there were opportunities for scholarships. And just as I talked to people, and I talked to people that were a couple of years older than me, you know, and as I got closer to college, talked to friends who were in college about different career choices, I realized that the interest I had in science and math probably put me on a pathway to better financial stability, right? And I'd also seen my father work in a job for decades that it didn't seem like he enjoyed it. And so I wanted to find something that I could do, that I could support myself, that would also allow me to have a satisfying and rewarding career. And so I decided to go into engineering, partly because I was torn between advanced math education and engineering. And a friend who was a little older said, well, here's the thing. If you go into education and you figure out you don't like it, and then you want to switch to engineering, you can't do that and get out of college in 4 years when your scholarships run out. But if you start in engineering, decide you don't like it, and want to switch to education, you'll still be able to get out in 4 years. Excuse me. And so,
complex problem to solve.
The first complex problem to solve. What's the backup plan, right? And so I started in engineering, went to the Ohio State University, partly because of scholarships that were available to me there and the affordability of that as an institution, because I didn't want to have a bunch of debt when I got out of school. And had a great education, had a lot of opportunities because of making that choice. But also, I never met an engineer until I got to college, right?
Wow.
So the first engineer that I ever met were professors at the university. So I committed to studying something that I really didn't have a good understanding of, but the more I learned, the more excited I got about the opportunities that were open. And in fact, how many opportunities were available if you studied engineering or other STEM fields of study, that were, the choices were much different than had I chose other disciplines to start with. And that kept me very excited. I then did some interning while I was still in college, got a better idea of what was involved in various aspects of the industry. And in fact, did an internship after my sophomore year in exploration and production in oil and gas. So that's the part of the business that figures out where to drill the wells, how to drill the wells safely, how to get the oil and gas out of the ground, and then deliver it to the pipelines, where it then goes to be made into a variety of products. But the upstream part of the business kind of lets go of it once it goes into the pipeline, and others take over from there. And it was like a giant puzzle every day, trying to figure out, where is the oil? How do we get it out in the best way possible, right? How do we figure out what's going on with the wells, right? And so it always felt like a puzzle where you were trying to figure out what was going on, sometimes 3 miles away from you underground, right? To keep the process flowing. And I really enjoyed that. As I went through my career, I got an opportunity to take on a lot of different kinds of roles. And then I started to see that as much as I was originally drawn to the business because of the technical challenges, I found that actually the hardest problems to solve usually were the ones around how the overall system worked and how people worked together or didn't, right? That made the problems more complicated. And that actually figuring out how to bring people together and enable them to be as successful as they had the potential to be was an even more challenging part of the business. And that's when I started to move into supervisory and then managerial roles. And ultimately winding up as a CEO, running a California oil and gas company for 5 years, right? And it really was about kind of taking things step by step, thinking about often, if this were my business, right? Whatever job I was in, if I was a supervisor or a department manager, if this were my business, how do we actually deliver value? And that's just not financial numbers. How do we make the business safer?
Right.
How do we make sure we're developing our employees and the employees feel valued in what they're doing, right? So how do we deliver that value better than we did last year, right? And where are the opportunities? Where are the risks? And how do we unleash the capacity that we've got to make a difference in this part of the business, right?
How exciting. So keep going, and I'll just tell you what I'm thinking, but go ahead.
So, and it, honestly, being a woman in oil and gas over 3 decades, I won't tell you that everybody I worked with, just embraced me with open arms and expected me to succeed. But I will say, I think many more people did than the industry often gets credit for. I think what helped me be successful was I almost came from such an odd background, right? So my parents didn't have a lot of expectations about what I was going to do educationally. I had to figure out why I was there. So I always had an underlying desire or compass, right, that was driving me on about figuring out how these things worked and figuring out how I could make a difference. And one of the great things about working in a technical field, even if you don't see a lot of other role models that might look exactly like you, that commitment around understanding those challenges and contributing to those challenges, your ability to think independently, maybe partly because my background was so different, actually creates opportunities. And it's about kind of having your spidey sense up to say, okay, if that opportunity isn't going to be available to me, where else can I go and contribute and learn what I need to learn next, right? Yeah. And usually there's some other place where somebody's looking for talent and they'll be happy to have you come join if you're committed to making a difference and helping people around you be successful. Well, you might have to take a little different path, yes. But if you just keep looking for those opportunities, you will find them.
Let's emphasize that there isn't a straight line between where we start and where we end up. And if you think there is, perhaps there was at one point, but no more. And I don't really think there ever was. But it isn't about others making the path for you. It's about you being able to control and accelerate your own growth and curiosity and know yourself and tell a story that is embraced by others and not threatening. It isn't about I, it's about we. I hear a lot of this is around collaboration. This is creativity. This isn't about an ego that needs to soar. This is about a woman who wants to build. Yes. Now,
absolutely.
I need a few illustrations though, because I'm just a curious person. So as you're digging for oil let's see, in the underground deep water area, and then the Arctic strategy, lessons learned, insights to share. I'm just curious, what was it like and how did you live there?
Well, it looked different at different times, right? I mean, sure so, kind of, a parallel path on this journey. I actually met my husband on a rig in the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh, that's a great story all by itself.
Right. And I think, any woman that is going to be successful in business, you make lots of decisions that help you along the way in business, but I've got to say who you choose as your spouse. Yes. And the level of support that they're willing to put on the table to make your partnership work, to make you successful, for you to make them successful, boy, that's a really important choice,
I
you know,
agree.
and it can make the road a lot easier, or it can make the road exponentially more difficult, right?
Yes.
And so that's an important choice. Choices I made career-wise as well, we're also trying to balance. You know, we had a child fairly early in my career, and because my husband worked away from home about 50% of the time, there were times in my career when I knew I wanted to limit how much I wanted to travel or what kind of roles I wanted to be in for a period of time, but you know, because uh, she needed a level of stability at home that I wanted to make sure we could provide.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'd think that that might automatically change what you have the potential to do, and it probably did. But a career is a very long runway,
Yeah.
right? And so again, the path may take some jogs in it, but it's about how are you true to your values? How are you true to the talents that you start to realize that you've got or that you have the ability to develop, right?
Yes.
And what's your plan for what, you know, the next looks like and the next after that? And how do you start to gain the skills and experience that you think you're going to need?
Yep.
If you were the hiring manager, right, what would you be looking for, and how do you put yourself in that position, right? So, you know, at one point in time, I'll tell you about a story when I was um, actually working as a VP in the Gulf of Mexico for Shell, and we had done a lot of good things in the organization, but we had seen our safety performance plateau. So compared to where we had been 5 years before, we were doing great. But when I looked at the number of people that still were getting hurt, right, and going home hurt in our operations day in and day out, the number was really too high, right? And when I had come into that role, I knew, you know, I had worked in the global headquarters, leading a big safety improvement effort. I knew all the things to do technically, and we had done all those things technically, right? And we had still kind of hit this wall where we
Mm-hmm.
weren't getting any better, doing everything we knew how to do, but it wasn't good enough. And I had went home over the holidays, had to look myself in the mirror and say, you know, my people are generating the level of performance that my leadership is asking for. And so, what is it about the way I'm leading that has got to shift if we're going to get to a place where everybody in our operation is going home safe at the end of every hitch? Had to do a lot of soul searching, had to reach out to some people and ask for help, right? So I could look at some people in some other organizations that were making faster progress. You know, were they willing to talk to me when I picked up the phone? They absolutely were.
Yep.
You know, and to share their story with me. And then it really was about sitting down with the leaders that reported to me and saying, okay, here's our performance. We've got to own this, right? And it was interesting because I, you know, asked them to do some things that were pretty pressing on their parts, right? And their plates were already full, and I was asking them to spend a lot more time working with their people in this area, and it wasn't clear what was going to come off their plate to enable that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the more senior people that worked for me looks at me and he says, well, this is all well and good, and we're all bought into what you're encouraging us to move forward on. He said, but you know, you're asking a lot of us, and we don't see that you put any skin in this game.
Oh, that's an interesting. That was, you remember that vividly. I can.
Oh, vividly. Now, the interesting thing was that coincidentally, as I'd been thinking about how I could lead different, I actually already had an action plan that I had planned to put in place, but I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't shared that with the rest of the team. And I said, well, here's what I'm going to do. Everybody makes fun of how busy my schedule is, and it is. And I'm going to tell you every single time somebody gets hurt anywhere in our operation, as long as I'm in the United States. I said, so if I'm at somewhere in Europe, you know, at global leadership team meetings, I can't honor this, but I will. It'll just take me longer to honor it. I said, as long as I'm in the United States, Within 48 hours, I'll sit down with, the operations manager, who was based in the same office I was in, with the actual site manager, with the supervisor of the person who got hurt, and if there's anybody else in that kind of chain of command. And we're going to have an open and honest discussion about what we missed, what we have to learn, what they need, right? And so at first, quite honestly, I was kind of going all over the place and breaking into my calendar a couple of times a month.
Yes.
Which sent a loud message to the organization. And in fact, one of the times I actually went to site on December 23rd, and I went home on Christmas Eve.
Yes.
Because that's when, the injury had occurred. And boy, did that send a message to that crew about how serious we were about wanting to understand what was going on and how we needed to change.
Yes.
So that they could go home safe, to their families at the end of every hitch. And that was a real turning point, because for me, as a female leader, in an oil and gas company, saying you don't know all the answers, and in fact, we're going to experiment and we're just going to keep at it until we figure out how to make this better.
Yeah.
That's not a traditional way to lead.
But no command and control going on here.
No, but a mentor of mine, many years before this has said, your value for safety has to be higher than your discomfort at what you'll need to do to change. And I thought I understood what that meant at the time. And I thought, well, of course, my value for safety is higher than that. When I had to look in the mirror and say, am I willing to walk into my guys and say, I don't have the answers, but this is what we're going to try next?
Yes.
Right. And we're going to figure our way through this.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn together. That was a moment of truth for me. How bad did I want it?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And the results were?
We actually we reduced the amount of injuries for the next 2 years by 60% every year.
That's a big deal.
It was. And when you think about every one of those people, even if they were going home, with a few stitches in their hand, A, it might have been much more serious. And B, well, that was going to interfere with their life when they got home.
Yes, I know.
Whatever it is that they chose to do in their free time, whether they had kids or they didn't have kids, it was a disruption in their life that they didn't deserve to have to deal with, right? So it was a very big deal. And again, we can talk about policies and we can talk about values till the cows come home. The question is, what are we doing to really demonstrate them? And how do we send a message to people about what's important and how important they are to us without saying a word?
Yes.
Just by them being able to see how you show up is really important.
Now, this is, a rich conversation and I'm enjoying it. But some of the things that we're looking at for your next phase in your journey is, how do you take all of these lessons learned, experiences that many other people will never experience, and become, you're no longer the CEO of a company, you're looking at the next phase in your own life. And what's the multiplier here? Because just that you did it and your group did it was great. What do you want to see next? Because I think that's where the reflection is turning into for yourself. What matters to me in my next phase of my journey here? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, and I actually, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd like to help people understand how they can be more effective, not only in their career, but even in their personal life, about seeing the opportunity to make different choices, right? And having that create better outcomes. And that can be at work or it can be at home. So I think one of the hallmarks of my career, and it looked different at different phases, but one of the hallmarks of my career was learning practical ways to bring people together to solve problems that seem too complex, right? So these are the kind of problems that maybe you've tried 2 or 3 easy answers, and they haven't really given you the results that you want, the improvement that you want, or it may actually have created new problems for you, right? And so how do you kind of break that cycle and see opportunities to problem solve differently? So when I worked for Era had built a very strong problem solving capability. They were a company that ran via lean manufacturing. So that's the way of designing work processes and solving problems that Toyota had created, right? And then they applied it to the oil and gas business. So they had a lot of discipline about solving problems. But if you don't think about the why, and I'd say employ a few things that I want to share with you, you can almost become so rote in the way you think about problems that you don't actually get to the root of the problem and actually solve it.
That's a
You
big thought.
just paper over it, so to speak. And in fact, one of the things that I saw that cropped up in that system for a little while, we I think got around it, was that if you have a particular set of questions that you ask, you can actually reverse engineer that process to implement a solution that you think the solution is the right answer. And I've been in a lot of organizations where people think they're solving a problem, but what they're actually doing is advocating for a particular solution without defining the problem up front.
Yes.
And that usually is not as successful as it needs to be.
Yes.
So the key is, I think the first question you have to ask is, why do we even need to work on this at all? Now, it may be a pet peeve for you, but is it really worth the time and the effort to take it on, to think about what the real problem is, to create a few collaborators, which will probably be important if it's a complex problem for you to fully understand it. Others will need to be impacted by it as well, right? Or they're not going to put the time into helping you solve it. So first, why do you need to solve it at all? Is it an irritation, or does it really need to be tackled, and why now?
Yes.
So how do you define in objective terms what this is costing you, or what opportunity is precluding from happening, and taking the time to kind of go, but relative to everything else that we're working on, why would this go to the top of the list?
Yeah.
Just thinking about those things before you get started actually is really important, right? Because you can't do 10 major things at one time and do them well. You could probably only do 1 or 2, right? If they're really significant. So why that problem, and why now? Then once you get thinking about it, can you really explain the problem, right? And I would challenge from at least 2 points of view. So what's the problem? Why now? And how does it look to you? But how does it look to somebody else in the organization, maybe who vehemently disagrees with you?
Yep.
Right? You've got to see the problem from at least 2 very different points of view, or you don't understand the problem.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, that's exactly
right. Then you start to work with others and actually trying to understand that other point of view, going to somebody else in a different part of the organization, or somebody you know that would actually disagree with you, and just listening to them talk about what it is that you think is a problem. Where's the commonality? Yeah. Right? Look at it through their eyes. Or, if you're seeing the problem because that group is so screwed up, well, I bet it looks entirely different in that other group, right? What are they saying about that, right? And taking the time to understand that. Well, then the question is, how do you think about what options there might be to solve it, right? And don't stop at one, right? Push yourself to come up with multiple ways that you think you might be able to solve this. Again, work with others, test what you see as the problem statement, test it, the points of view around what this encompasses and what it doesn't encompass. And then, what are different ways that different groups would suggest to solve this, right? And then which one do you think is the right one and why? And I think a really important part of this is if you've done your homework, the perfect solution is very rare, right? If you don't think about it very robustly, you're going to know what the answer is pretty quickly, and it's going to be easy.
Yeah.
But if this is a complex problem, you're probably, one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell, the economist, is, there's no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? So when you think about the multiple solutions you would have to this problem, where are those trade-offs? And so which one do you think gives you the best performance for the least amount of effort, or the best performance that's consistent with your company culture, or the most effective long-term solution, because it's actually pragmatic enough that you can implement it. Maybe it gets you 80% of the way there, but if it's relatively easy to implement, maybe that takes away the pain and actually gets you where you need to be. And the last 20% isn't worth chasing, right? So thinking through those kind of trade-offs, right? So that you can have an impact, and you do it in a way that it's not just you telling people what the right answer is, but you've worked with others to really improve quality of life, satisfaction with the work environment, and you've had a positive impact on how everybody involved in this process actually contributes. And you've learned some things along the way.
When you do come to a decision, it's full of the paradox of choice that Barry Schwartz talks about, where you end up feeling like, if I had just a little more time, I could figure out a little bit better decision. And so I won't decide now because the abundance of options are overwhelming. So why decide? Because whatever I decide won't be right anyhow. I love what goes on in the internet world, where you buy stuff more than you need and probably testing different sizes, and then you send back most of it. And then you go back on to see if you could have gotten it cheaper someplace else. And the shopping experience is a decision process, pretty complicated at times, where you're never convinced that your decision was the right one. It was just one of those options, and you had to finally decide. But the world has so many options today that sometimes you feel stalled or stuck by trying to figure out, well, which one will my boss like? Or which one, will I have the least problem doing, or which is going to be my least, I take the most complicated or the most simple. And I do think his quote is correct, that there's just too many options. And how do we decide? What did you learn?
Well, I think I learned a couple of things. One is, the more complicated your solution is, the less likely it is to succeed. And even if you can implement it, you probably can't sustain it. Right? Because other things will come along to draw attention. So I have learned that really thinking about, yes, but if we go ahead and implement this, how dramatically is it going to change how we work, and how much energy is it going to take to keep this solution in place, right? Yes. Over time. And so I think thinking a little pragmatically, and if you've got an equal chance of being successful, err on the side of the simpler solution. Yes. I think the other advantage to that is that if you think you can get a good way down the road with a pretty simple solution that's easy to sustain, go ahead and do that. You'll learn a few more things in that process. Yep. That maybe then you have to tweak a few things on the back end. But it's much easier than trying to implement something whole scale that maybe you think was perfect, right? But not very pragmatic. And so, part of it is knowing the organization. Part of it is knowing the resources that are available, right? Even those questions about why are you solving it and why are you solving it now will help direct you to what that right answer is as you measure some of those trade-offs. There may be something just so critical that you're working on that actually the whole company needs to reorient it to either capture that opportunity or prevent that risk from being actualized. There are times like that, but they're very few and far between.
I was going
right?
to ask you,
In
most
the
of it is
day-to-day
edge.
phrase. Yeah.
You're sort of on the edges and moving. Don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. And how do you look to the edges as opposed to trying to create a whole new sandbox? And that's often I find as I'm working. So, I'm a corporate anthropologist and I work with organizations that need or want to change. And as I'm listening to you, I'm saying, I have a couple of clients who are at a point in their growth where growth is stalled. And these are strange times. And so the question becomes, do I fix what I have now so I can do better at it? Or do I try to move it into new market spaces in different fashion, or change the sales story? Or what do I do to accelerate growth again, ignite it? And those are not small questions, because usually the trend lines have been going along and then all of a sudden they're in the wrong direction. We work with one university, went from 12,000 students to 8,000. And I said, when are you going to call us? I mean, that was the wrong direction. We work with a major manufacturer of coffins, and their sales had gone from $1 billion to 500,000, and people weren't using the product anymore the same way. And there are some trend lines where you got to reinvent what you're doing, but often you just have to be on the edges, trying to see what's possible through a fresh lens so that you can do better.
Well, and I think that's the real key, right? So, I've seen examples in the course of my career where people want to adopt a new strategy, right? And it's all going to be hearts and flowers and everything's a hockey stick to the right. If we just go do this, magic will happen. But you're not asking the tough questions about, well, what are our underlying capabilities?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So is there a match here? If you only have to build one or two new capabilities, that's serious, but doable if you focus on it, right? And you really think strategically and resource strategically to build those capabilities. Yeah. But if what you're trying to create actually requires the culture of the company to be different, your talent pool to be completely different, and requires several capabilities that you don't currently have, you may be able to draw a plan out that in theory, looks great, but your chances of actually delivering that are pretty darn slim, right? So again, I haven't found a formula, but I do think it's about how you pragmatically think about, right? How much change can your organization handle?
Yeah.
Some organizations are very comfortable with a high pace of change, and some aren't.
No.
So if you really need to make a change, maybe part of that is really recognizing what you have to do to start to build a level of resilience and comfort with change in your organization that doesn't exist. But that will absolutely derail what you're trying to do if you don't take that head on. And that does mean you have to engage with your leaders differently. You have to bring in some opportunities to develop them differently. And in some cases, you may find that you've got some leaders that were great for the journey you were on before.
Yes.
Right? But maybe they're not in the right role anymore. Or maybe this organization where it's headed may not even be where they want to go. And just being honest with that, treating them respectfully, in that space, but being willing, if the right thing for your employees, your stakeholders, and your business is moving in a given direction, then everybody's got to get on board to help make that happen.
Yes.
Right.
I'm thinking about it. I have a talk to give for the Enterprise Agility Conference, a global conference on building a culture for fast changing times. And the times are just moving very fast.
They are.
And change fatigue is not uncommon. But people don't know quite how to change. And they haven't figured out how to put it into their Happyville here. It's a habit where they immediately can sort through the options available in a systematic fashion and begin to be comfortable that the choices they make are small wins going somewhere. They may not be enormous. You don't always need a pandemic to change a little bit. I had a client who was giving remote work as a benefit to his employees before the pandemic. And now he has them all working remotely and can't get them to come back in the office. And I said, well, it was a benefit then, but it's a penalty box now. Look how interesting the meaning of something has changed. So be careful how you interpret what the benefit is to somebody else and how we change them. But this is a fascinating conversation. Christina, one of the things that you and I had chatted about was that the problems that you've learned to solve may or may not be in the toolkit or the interests of young people looking at the STEM industry, engineering, oil and gas, but anything in the science, technology, engineering, math, and even, some people add the arts on there because I do think creative arts are tied into how we think. You're talking about creative problem solving. It's a real whole brain storytelling, re-understanding. And once you understand that, it isn't a technical skill, it's a perception of reality that works. How are you advising? What do you see? Because there's so much literature on how women aren't sticking out in STEM. It's it's not a place where people of color find themselves comfortable. Moving up through the hierarchy is difficult. But part of your own mission now is to begin to identify these folks who may not want to move into this zone, but really could find great gratification. What are your thoughts?
Well, I just like to spend time talking with young people, as I have the opportunity to do, to really, again, this is part of problem solving. What are your real choices, right? And kind of just as simple as thinking about what are the pros and cons of those, right? And something that I learned a long time ago, and I try and encourage young people around this as well, is early on, I think you've got to get really clear about whether that voice you're listening to is one that's based out of fear or based in a place around the vision of what you're trying to create for your life and others. Right? And I promise you, you will never reach your potential staying on what you see as the safe path.
Yeah.
Right? Now, that doesn't mean you should be taking life-threatening risks. But often when we unpack what we see as risky, it's because it makes us uncomfortable. But I have never learned anything. I have never grown in the course of my career where it felt safe. I didn't know the answer when I started.
I know.
Right? But and that means sometimes you're gonna scrape your knee and you're gonna clean it up, you're gonna put a Band-Aid on it, and you're gonna keep going. And that's okay.
Well, you have to say that many times because I love Oprah and her advocacy for small wins, because I preach the same. I said you cannot turn a battleship with an oar, but you don't want to either. What you really want to do are find those small wins that move you forward so that you can learn what works and what doesn't without great risk, but enough risk so that you're testing and trying and learning. And these are all, the whole world of mistakology is about what you learn from making mistakes, right? And that's a really big thought. So as you're working with these young folks or up and comers, what are you finding?
Well, one thing that I'm finding is, I hate to say this, but I'm not sure that they're always getting good career counseling, which really disappoints me, right? So when I was high school age, as I mentioned, I didn't have a lot of resources at home helping to guide me. And even the guidance counselors that we had back then, I remember the one that I had to deal with telling me that, nursing or teaching was a perfectly fine thing for me to consider, but why in the world would I think about engineering, right?
Well, I've heard that story before.
Yeah. And I guess I was so naive that I didn't think that it was going to be an issue, right? Thankfully, I didn't see the risk there, right? And so that kind of propelled me forward. But, part of it is really getting people to say, okay, so what are the real choices that intrigue you and why, right? And how is that likely to play out in the quality of life that you're hoping to have, right? So I do think there's this mystique that all college degrees lead to a certain outcome and a certain lifestyle, which they do not, right? And so, to what extent are you a person that's really turned on by challenge?
Yeah.
Right? To what extent do you like to be comfortable or like to feel like you have mastered something, right? Those are important questions to ask, right? Because some fields are easier to do that in than others, right? But also, I think it's very legitimate to have real candid conversations with people and say, if you go down this path, these are some of the life choices that likely are, you're going to face. And these are different life choices that you can be exposed to on a different path.
Mhm.
And so, how do you factor that in? Although you might be really passionate about this, right? Does it lead you where you ultimately want to go 20 years from now or 40 years from now, right? It's interesting. I think it's Mark Cuban who talks about, when he talks to young people, he says, if somebody is telling you to follow your passion, it's because they're already wealthy. And I don't think that's entirely true. I can say I had the luxury to follow my passion, right? And I think a lot of people would have told me that there was not much chance of that becoming a reality for me, right? At different phases of my life. But I do think helping people see it's not necessarily a binary decision. There could be multiple places where you can be challenged, right? You can learn things, you can figure out a way to contribute, right? And some of them will open up different kinds of financial and quality of life issues for you than others will. And I think it's just about being pragmatic about how you make those choices.
Yes.
And not saying I've got to be miserable or I can be happy, right? Or I'm only passionate about that. Well, why are you passionate about that? Is there some other fields
Yes.
maybe that can give you more of the total package that you want in your life that you might also feel passionate about, right?
It's interesting because I'm coaching one woman and she has a nice job, but she doesn't get the kind of gratification out of it she thinks she should. Although I'm not quite sure what she thinks she should. And it's sort of like, how do you, what would you define to be the right kind of work that you can do? You can raise your two children, you're making a nice living, you've got enough flexibility so that you don't need to be in the office all the time, you're really in control, you're almost a freelancer without calling it, and you've got good benefits. So tell me now, what would be a replacement part for this that would raise you to the next, what's missing? And I have a hunch what's missing is somebody acknowledging what she's doing and giving her a sense that she has a good purpose there, or something that gives it more than just tactical and practical, but something that matters, and she matters to them in some fashion. And I do think flexibility is an isolation, and I often laugh because we are enjoying this flexibility, but solitary confinement in prison is the worst place to be. And I'm not convinced that that isn't creating these kinds of reactions to, isn't there more? Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, and I even frame it a little differently. I mean, it's great if the work environment anticipates what you need and gives you what you need. In all honesty, I can tell you that certainly has often not been the case in the course of my career. And I will say at one point, I was advised by someone who was a mentor of mine and who I have just a ton of respect for. And he basically only had time to have a very short conversation with me, told me to apply for a job that I did not want at all, right? And told me it was an IQ test and had to hang up the phone. So apply for this job. This is what you need to do. And
I've heard that before.
Probably was the lowest job on the list that I could have thought of, even though it was going to be a big promotion for me. I just didn't want it. So I went home and spent a couple of days saying, how might I change this job so that I would want it? And so it would be a job that I would find to be highly rewarding. And when I sat down and had a conversation with the hiring manager, I said, look, if you want me to do the job the way it has always been done, please don't put me in it because I will be miserable and you will be miserable. But here's my vision for what I could do in this role and why I think it makes sense to approach the role this way. And, this is what I think how I could add value by doing it in this way and why it would be important to do. And I got the job. And in fact, it was one of the best jobs I ever had.
But you worked out.
Challenging,
Yes.
but I learned so much, and I learned about a different part of the business and
It's
different parts of the world. I mean, so I think often it's almost like, what is it about that job, right? And there's white space in every single job, at
Yes.
least that I've ever had, and I think that most people have. Where's the boundary that you
Yes.
want to just nudge, right? Because it will make you actually not just more satisfied, but probably more productive.
Yes.
And sometimes what that looks like for people is using some of that flexibility maybe to take some of your skills and work in another area where you feel passionate. It may be at a nonprofit,
Yes.
right? As a
That's just what we're
volunteer,
talking about.
right?
Exactly.
And
Well, I have to come from job.
recognizing that you actually can do that, and that satisfaction is about more than just work.
Yes.
It's about the totality of your life.
Yes.
It's how does it line up with your values? What about family and friends? What about your spirituality? What about uh, causes that you feel passionate about and want to contribute to? It covers a lot of the landscape. I've never been at a point in my life where I could tick all the boxes on all those and say it's all perfect at this moment in time, right? So it's a bit fluid and it goes back and forth, but it's how do you optimize across, all of that to give you the quality of life that you want to live, and that uh, makes you feel good about the conscious choices you've made
Yes.
about how to balance those things.
And every day is a gift. Christina, this has been absolutely wonderful. We could actually keep going, but we can't. So I'm going to ask you for only one thing you want our audience not to forget, because I think they've heard so much rich perspective on life, on the problems that we face in the work and the non-work life. They're equally relevant here. But also that your lessons learned over your career is now setting you up for the next phase where you want to give back in many different ways to help people soar. You're really on the brink, like I am, about what comes next and how. One thing you want them to remember.
So I really think that, if you've got an area that you see as a problem or an opportunity, right? Be really clear with yourself in terms of what those choices are, right? And why you might make them. And challenge yourself before you just automatically go down a path, right? To really perhaps get some other inputs to help you think through what are some different choices. Make sure you recognize we always have choices. Now, we may not like some of them, or we may like some of them less than others, right?
Or we may not even know what they are, right?
We always have a choice. It is very, very rare for a human being to be in a situation where they have no choices to make, right? And it's about that conscious choice that over time actually leads to the quality of life, right? That you can have. And I think it's a really important way when you recognize this to empower yourself, no matter where you are in your journey, right? And it is about staying on that journey, continuing to learn, continuing to make good choices, and moving forward. It's your journey.
It's your turn. Well, and the other part is you really don't know what's a good choice or a bad choice till after the choice. And I was reading something the other day, and the comment was, once something has happened, the best thing you can do is just let it happen, because you can't go backwards and change what's happened. But the best thing you can begin to do is learn something from it, move forward past it, and think about what comes next, because that's all we can do.
Well, I would challenge that. I think the other thing is giving yourself enough grace to
Yes.
say, did I make the best choice I could with what I knew at the time?
Yes.
Right.
And that's a very powerful point. With what I knew at the time.
At the time, right? We're not clairvoyant.
No, but the other part of it is, and then I will wrap up, is that what you hear isn't necessarily what someone else said or what they meant, but it is what you heard. And I can't tell you how often I work with my clients or my coaching clients about what did they really mean? as opposed to what did you think you heard and wanted them to mean? Because that's where the rubs come and sometimes the tensions as well. This has been such fun. To my listeners and my audience, thank you for joining us today. Christina Sistrunk has been with us, and I know you're going to have lots of questions. Send them along to info@andysimon.com. Christina, if they want to reach you, I know you're building your website, but what would be a good email? And then we'll have that on the blog as well.
Okay, it is Sistrunk, Sistrunk 1984 @gmail.com.
That's perfect. And I promise you, she will get back to you if you have these great questions or ideas, or you want some coaching or mentoring. Now, for all of our listeners, remember, both my books are available on Amazon, and I'm always very excited to hear your comments on Amazon. Rethink Smashing the Myths of Women in Business has been an award-winning bestseller. And On the Brink, A Fresh Lens to Take Your Business to New Heights is how a little anthropology can help your business grow, which is what we do. So thank you for joining us today. All of my listeners have propelled us to be among the top 5% global podcasts. That is truly an honor. And so whoever is listening, share it away. And you're going to want to share today's talk to people who you work with or you live with to listen about how do I solve these complex problems? Because they're all around us. And in times that are fast changing like they are, we need some skills and a mindset. And in some ways, this is a state of mind as opposed to a stuff. It's not a toolkit, but it is a way of thinking. Christina, thanks again for coming. And
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this. This is a highlight of my afternoon. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for coming to On the Brink.